The emergency room doors burst open as 6-year-old Emma Mae Thompson stumbled in, her princess dress torn and muddy, dragging a makeshift sled with a bloodied German shepherd twice her size. Dr. Sarah Miller's clipboard clattered to the floor. This wasn't a normal Saturday night at Heartland's only veterinary clinic. The child's small hands were raw and bleeding from rope burns, her blonde pigtails matted with sweat and tears. Nurses rushed forward, their gasps echoing through the sterile hallway as they took in the impossible sight. The massive dog's labored breathing filled the sudden silence, each wheeze a countdown to death. Emma's mud-streaked face looked up with the fierce determination that only comes from pure love. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Buddy needs help." Dr. Miller's hands trembled as she reached for her stethoscope. How had a 6-year-old managed to transport an 80-pound animal for miles? And where were the adults who should have been protecting this child from such impossible burdens? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 hours earlier, the morning sun had painted the cornfields of Heartland, Nebraska in shades of gold that reminded folks why their ancestors had settled here. Population 847, though that number kept shrinking as young families packed up for the cities, leaving behind empty farmhouses and the stubborn old-timers who refused to let go. At the Thompson farm on Maple Creek Road, Rosie Thompson sat at her kitchen table, counting crumpled bills for the third time. $17, $18, $19. She tucked them back into the mason jar labeled Emma's College Fund, with hands that had worked this land for 7 decades. The bank notice lay beside her coffee cup like a death sentence. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings, 30 days. "Lord willing, and the creek don't rise," she whispered, her grandmother's old saying feeling hollow this morning. At 72, Rosie had buried her husband Harold, raised her son Jake, and now found herself guardian to 6-year-old Emma Mae after that terrible car accident 2 years ago. The child was all the family she had left in this world. Emma Mae Thompson was the kind of 6-year-old who collected injured grasshoppers and named the barn cats after princesses. This morning she wore a faded pink dress that had once belonged to someone else's little girl, her blonde pigtails already escaping their ribbons as she played explorer in the backyard. She had her father Jake's stubborn chin and her mother's gentle heart, though she'd never remember either of them clearly. The morning routine never varied. Rosie would make oatmeal while Emma chattered about her dreams, usually involving talking animals and magical adventures. But today, Emma's chair sat empty, her breakfast growing cold as worried minutes ticked by. "Emma Mae!" Rosie called from the porch, her voice carrying across the fields where morning glory vines still clung to the fence posts. No answer came back except the whisper of wind through corn stalks, ready for harvest. It was then that she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. A high-pitched whimpering, desperate and pain-filled, coming from the direction of the old creek bed where Jake used to catch frogs as a boy. Rosie's heart, already weak from years of worry and hidden medical bills, began to race as she hurried toward the sound. The creek bed had gone dry this summer, leaving behind rocky pools and tangled brush perfect for a child's imagination. But as Rosie pushed through the elderberry bushes, what she found wasn't Emma's latest adventure. It was something that would test every lesson she'd ever learned about compassion, courage, and the impossible things love could make a person do. There, caught in the vicious steel jaws of an illegal leg-hold trap, lay a massive German shepherd. Blood stained the dried creek bed around his trapped hind leg, and his golden brown eyes held the resigned look of an animal who had given up hope. Beside him, her small hands already working at the trap's mechanism, knelt Emma Mae, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. "Grandma, he's hurt real bad," Emma whispered, her small fingers still working at the trap's cruel mechanism despite the blood on her hands. The German shepherd's breathing came in shallow pants, his magnificent coat matted with dirt and dried blood. One amber eye tracked Rosie's approach while the other remained fixed on Emma with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Rosie knelt beside her granddaughter, her knees protesting against the rocky ground. The trap was a vicious thing, illegal in these parts for good reason. The steel jaws had bitten deep into the dog's left hind leg, though mercifully it appeared the bone remained intact. Still, infection had clearly set in, and the animal's dehydration was evident in his dry nose and labored breathing. "How long you been here, boy?" Rosie murmured, noting the trampled earth around the trap site. The dog had fought hard before exhaustion claimed him. "Emma May, step back now." Wild animals can be unpredictable when they're hurt. But Emma shook her head with the stubborn determination that reminded Rosie so painfully of Jake. "He's not wild, Grandma. Look at his eyes. He knows we want to help." She gently touched the dog's massive head, and instead of snapping or growling, he actually leaned into her touch. "He's been waiting for someone to find him." Against every practical instinct she possessed, Rosie found herself believing her granddaughter. There was something different about this dog, something in his intelligent gaze that spoke of training and discipline rather than wild instinct. His coat beneath the dirt and blood showed signs of good care. Someone had loved this animal. "All right, honey, but we need to be careful," Rosie said, studying the trap mechanism. She'd grown up in hunting country and knew these devices too well. "When I release this, he might bolt or he might bite. Either way, you stay behind me." The release required her to press down on two spring-loaded arms simultaneously while Emma gently lifted the dog's injured leg free. The moment the metal jaws opened, the German shepherd let out a whimper that sounded almost like relief, but he made no attempt to flee. Instead, he tried to stand and immediately collapsed, his injured leg unable to bear weight. "He's dying, isn't he?" Emma's voice was small, frightened, in a way that reminded Rosie that this child had already lost too much in her short life. Rosie examined the wound more closely. The leg was badly infected, the dog severely dehydrated, but these weren't necessarily fatal conditions. Not if they could get him to Dr. Miller's clinic in town. The problem was, town was 8 miles away. Her old truck hadn't started in 3 weeks, and they had exactly $19 to their name. "Hurt things need doctors," Emma announced with the simple logic of childhood. "We have to take him to Dr. Miller. Honey, look at him. He's got to weigh 80, maybe 90 pounds. I can't carry him, and you surely can't." Rosie's heart ached as she watched Emma's face fall. Sometimes wanting to help isn't enough. But Emma was already looking around the creek bed with the calculating expression she got when solving puzzles. "Remember when you told me about Great-Grandpa pulling his plow after the horse died? You said Thompson women don't give up when something needs doing. Emma May, that's different. This is—" "I know where Daddy's old wagon is," Emma interrupted, her eyes bright with sudden inspiration. "In the barn, under the tarps. If we can get Buddy onto it, I can pull him, like a sled." The idea was absurd. A 6-year-old child pulling a full-grown German shepherd 8 miles to town. But as Rosie looked at her granddaughter's determined face, she remembered other impossible things the Thompson family had accomplished. Her own grandmother walking 5 miles in a blizzard to fetch the doctor when Rosie's grandfather took ill. Her mother keeping the farm running single-handed during the Depression. Jake becoming a police officer despite everyone saying a farm boy couldn't handle city crime. "Even if we could manage it," Rosie said gently, "Dr. Miller's treatment won't be free. And Saturday afternoon rates." Emma was already tearing a strip from her favorite dress, the pink one Jake had bought her last Christmas, the one she called her princess dress. She wrapped it carefully around the dog's injured leg, her movements surprisingly gentle and sure. "This will help until we get there," she told the dog solemnly. "It's magic because my daddy picked it out and he never let anything bad happen to anybody." The German Shepherd's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but acknowledgment. He seemed to understand that these two females meant him no harm. When Emma placed her small hand on his head again, he actually closed his eyes and sighed, as if he'd been waiting a very long time for such kindness. "Grandma," Emma said, looking up with eyes that held too much wisdom for 6 years old, "what if God sent Buddy to us because he knew we needed something to take care of? What if helping him helps us, too?" The makeshift sled scraped against the gravel road as Emma leaned into the rope harness she'd fashioned from old climbing rope found in Jake's closet. Every few steps, she'd stop to check on Buddy, whose massive form barely fit on the wooden platform they'd cobbled together from Jake's old wagon and some barn planks. Rosie walked alongside, one weathered hand resting on the dog's side to monitor his breathing, the other clutching her heart medication that she prayed she wouldn't need. They'd made it perhaps half a mile when the sound of an approaching pickup truck cut through the morning air. Rosie's stomach dropped as she recognized the faded blue Ford, Marcus Wheeler's truck. Of all the neighbors who could have found them in this vulnerable moment, Marcus was probably the worst choice. The truck slowed and pulled alongside them, dust swirling in its wake. Marcus Wheeler climbed out, his weathered face set in the permanent scowl he'd worn since his divorce 2 years ago. At 45, he looked older, worn down by the twin burdens of single parenthood and a struggling farm. His son Tommy peered through the passenger window, wide eyes taking in the strange procession. "Rosie Thompson, what in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His gaze fell on Buddy, and something dark flickered across his features. "That's a German Shepherd." "It's an injured animal that needs help," Rosie replied carefully. She'd known Marcus since he was Tommy's age, but the man standing before her now was harder, colder than the boy who used to help with hay baling. Marcus circled the sled, his expression growing grimmer. "Where'd you find it?" "Down by Miller's Creek," Emma piped up before Rosie could stop her. "He was caught in a mean trap. Someone hurt him really bad, Mr. Wheeler." Marcus's face went white, then flushed red. He knelt beside the sled and examined the trap wounds more closely, his jaw working silently. When he stood, his hands were clenched into fists. "That's my trap." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock. Rosie felt Emma's small hand slip into hers, sensing the sudden tension even if she didn't understand its source. "Your trap?" Rosie's voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus heard the judgment anyway. "I set them along the property line," Marcus said defensively. "Posted signs warning people to keep their dogs away. There's been too many incidents with loose animals lately." "Incidents?" Emma asked innocently. "What kind of incidents?" Marcus glanced down at his son in the truck, then back at the little girl whose guileless question had cut straight to the heart of his pain. "Tommy was attacked by a German Shepherd last year, outside his mother's new place in Council Bluffs. Dog came out of nowhere, knocked him down, bit his arm and face. 47 stitches. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Rosie understood now. The traps, the hostility, the way Tommy rarely left his father's side anymore. Marcus wasn't just being cruel, he was being protective in the only way he knew how. "I'm sorry," Rosie said quietly. "I didn't know." "Course you didn't. Nobody around here talks about anything real anymore." Marcus's voice carried years of bitterness. "Just pretend everything's fine while kids get mauled and farms get foreclosed and good people leave because there's nothing left worth staying for." Emma had been listening with the intense concentration children bring to adult conversations they sense are important. Now she spoke up with the fearless honesty that only 6-year-olds possess. "But Mr. Wheeler, Buddy didn't hurt anybody. He's just scared and hurt like Tommy was." "You don't understand," Marcus began. "I understand scared," Emma interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I was scared when Mommy and Daddy died. I was scared when Grandma cried at night and thought I couldn't hear. But being scared doesn't mean I get to hurt other people who didn't do anything wrong." Marcus stared at the child, clearly unprepared for such direct wisdom. In the truck, Tommy had rolled down his window to better hear the conversation, his young face pale but curious. "These dogs are dangerous," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The one that attacked Tommy." "Was one dog?" Rosie said gently. "This is a different dog, Marcus. Look at him. Really look." Against his better judgment, Marcus did look. Buddy's intelligent amber eyes met his without aggression or challenge. Despite his pain and weakness, the dog's expression held only a weary dignity, as if he understood he was being judged and found it sadly familiar. "Some dogs are mean," Emma said thoughtfully. "Some people are mean too." "But that doesn't mean all dogs are bad or all people are bad. Daddy always said you judge everyone by their own actions, not by what somebody else did. Your daddy never had to hold his 9-year-old son while doctors stitched his face back together," Marcus replied, but the anger was draining out of his voice, replaced by something rawer and more honest. From the truck came a small voice. "Daddy, can I see?" Marcus's shoulders sagged. "Tommy, no. Stay in the truck." But Tommy was already climbing out, moving with the careful deliberation of a child who'd learned that the world could hurt without warning. He approached the sled slowly, staying well behind his father, but his eyes were fixed on Buddy with unmistakable curiosity. "He's really big," Tommy whispered. 85 pounds, Emma said proudly, as if she'd raised Buddy herself. "But he's gentle." "Want to see?" "Emma, no," both Rosie and Marcus said simultaneously, but Emma was already placing her small hand on Buddy's massive head. The dog's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement. Tommy took one small step closer, then another. "Does he bite?" "Only if someone tries to hurt him first," Emma said with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 minutes becoming an expert on German Shepherd behavior. "But we're not going to hurt him, are we?" The question hung in the air, and everyone present understood it wasn't really about the dog anymore. The standoff stretched on as Tommy edged closer to the sled, his fascination warring with deeply ingrained fear. Marcus watched his son with the intensity of a hawk, ready to snatch him away at the first sign of danger. But Buddy remained perfectly still, his amber eyes tracking the boy's movement with what looked remarkably like patience. "Tommy, that's close enough," Marcus warned, but his son had already reached the edge of the sled. The boy's small fingers hovered inches from Buddy's fur, trembling with the effort of overcoming months of nightmares and anxiety. "He's not growling," Tommy whispered, wonder creeping into his voice. The other dog was always growling. Emma beamed at this observation. "That's because Buddy's a good dog. He just needs help getting better." She looked up at Marcus with the unwavering directness that made adults uncomfortable. "Sometimes when we're hurt, we need other people to believe we're good, even when we can't prove it ourselves." Before Marcus could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. "What's going on here?" Pastor John Williams approached from the direction of town, his Saturday morning jog interrupted by the unusual sight of neighbors gathered around what appeared to be a wounded animal. At 68, Pastor Williams had been ministering to Heartland's dwindling congregation for 35 years. He'd buried Marcus's father, married Marcus and his ex-wife, and baptized Tommy. His presence changed the dynamic immediately. Marcus straightened, Tommy stepped back from the sled, and even Rosie seemed to compose herself differently. "Morning, Pastor," Rosie said carefully. "We're just trying to get this injured dog to Dr. Miller's clinic." Pastor Williams took in the makeshift sled, Emma's rope burns, and the obvious tension between the adults. His weathered face creased with concern as he knelt beside Buddy, his experienced eyes assessing the animal's condition. "This is Jake's dog," he said quietly. The words hit Rosie like a physical blow. "What?" "Buddy, Jake's K-9 partner. I remember him from the funeral." Pastor Williams gently touched the dog's collar, now visible beneath the matted fur. "He disappeared that day. Nobody could find him anywhere." The revelation sent shockwaves through the small group. Rosie's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes as memories crashed over her. Jake in his dress uniform, proud as could be when he introduced Buddy to the family. Jake explaining how his partner had saved his life twice in the line of duty. Jake promising that someday when he retired, Buddy would come live on the farm. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That was 3 years ago." "Dogs grieve too," Pastor Williams said gently, "especially working dogs. They form bonds that don't break easy." He looked at Emma, who was staring at Buddy with new understanding. "Sometimes they wander, looking for something they've lost." Emma's face lit up with sudden comprehension. "Grandma, that's why I dreamed about Daddy with a dog. He was trying to tell me about Buddy." Rosie knelt beside the sled, her arthritic joints protesting as she studied Buddy's face more carefully. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see it, the intelligence, the training, the way he held himself even in pain. This was indeed Jake's partner, the dog her son had talked about with such pride and affection. "Oh boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've been looking for him all this time, haven't you? You've been trying to come home." Buddy's tail moved slightly at the sound of her voice, and for the first time since they'd found him, he made a sound, not a whimper of pain, but a soft whine of recognition. Somehow he remembered Jake's mother, remembered the scent of home and family. The emotional weight of the moment wasn't lost on Marcus, who found himself caught between his protective instincts and a growing understanding that this situation was more complex than he'd realized. "Even if that's true," he said slowly, "he's still a German shepherd. The breed is aggressive by nature." "No more aggressive than people," Pastor Williams replied mildly, "and considerably more loyal, in my experience." Tommy had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus children bring to matters they sense are important. Now he spoke up with the devastating honesty that only 9-year-olds possess. "Daddy, the dog that hurt me, he was sick, remember? The policeman said he had rabies. That's why he was mean." Marcus's face went white. In all the trauma and aftermath of Tommy's attack, he'd somehow buried that crucial detail. The attacking dog hadn't been normally aggressive. It had been suffering from rabies, a disease that turned any animal violent and unpredictable. His hatred of all German shepherds had been based on one sick animal's actions. "I remember," he said quietly, the admission seeming to drain something vital from him. I couldn't separate the two in my mind." "Fear has a way of making everything look the same," Pastor Williams observed. "That's why we need each other, to help us see clearly when we can't do it alone." Emma, who had been following the conversation with the seriousness of someone far older than her 6 years, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Wheeler, if you help us save Buddy, maybe Tommy won't be scared of dogs anymore. Maybe helping something hurt could help Tommy feel better too." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in months. Tommy had grown thinner over the past year, more withdrawn. The confident, adventurous boy who used to climb trees and chase fireflies had been replaced by someone who flinched at unexpected sounds and rarely strayed from his father's side. "What do you think, son?" Marcus asked, his voice gentler than it had been all morning. "Do you want to help save Jake's dog?" Tommy's response was barely a whisper. "Can I touch him first, to make sure he's really not mean?" Emma immediately scooted aside to make room. "Put your hand right here," she instructed, guiding Tommy's trembling fingers to a spot behind Buddy's ears. "He likes it when you scratch gently." The moment Tommy's hand made contact with Buddy's fur, something remarkable happened. The dog, despite his pain and weakness, turned his great head slightly and began to pant, not from distress, but with something that looked remarkably like contentment. It was as if he recognized a kindred spirit, another wounded soul in need of healing. "He's warm," Tommy said with wonder, "and soft." The other dog felt hot and wrong, but Buddy feels normal. Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for a year start to blur his vision. Watching his son overcome his deepest fear through simple compassion was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we could give Dr. Miller a call, see what she says about his condition." But Pastor Williams was already pulling out his cell phone. "I've got a better idea. May Henderson's been looking for a way to help the community more. Let me see if she'll open the general store and organize some folks. If we're going to save this dog, we're going to do it right." As the pastor made his calls, more neighbors began to appear, drawn by curiosity and the small-town telegraph that somehow carried news faster than any modern technology. Mrs. Henderson arrived within minutes, her general store keys in hand and a determined look on her weathered face. Behind her came Dr. Miller herself, summoned from her Saturday morning garden work and looking both professional and deeply moved by the situation. "Well, I'll be," Dr. Miller said as she knelt beside Buddy and began her examination. "Jake's partner. I wondered what happened to him." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, assessing the wound, calculating dosages in her head. "He's dehydrated and that leg's infected, but he's strong, good muscle tone, decent weight. He's been taking care of himself reasonably well." "Can you save him?" Emma asked, her voice small and hopeful. Dr. Miller smiled at the little girl who had somehow orchestrated this unlikely rescue mission. "Honey, with the right care and a little luck, I think Buddy's going to be just fine. But it's going to take some work, and it won't be cheap." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her chin set with determination. "How much are we talking about, Sarah? Treatment for the infection, antibiotics, fluids, pain medication? Probably around $300, maybe more if complications arise." A silence fell over the group as the financial reality set in. $300 might as well have been $3,000 for most of the families in Heartland. The town was struggling, farms were failing, and disposable income was something most folks only remembered from better times. Emma looked around at the circle of adults, her 6-year-old mind working to understand why money always seemed to make grown-ups sad. "But if everyone gives a little bit," she said logically, "it adds up to a lot, right? Like when we collected pennies at school for the new playground." Mrs. Henderson's face lit up. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured. "Emma's right. This is what communities do. We take care of each other, and that includes the four-legged members, too." Dr. Miller's makeshift examination area in May Henderson's general store back room had become the town's unofficial emergency center. Buddy lay on a thick blanket, an IV line in his front leg providing much-needed fluids, while Dr. Miller worked to clean and treat the infected trap wound. Emma sat cross-legged beside him, one small hand resting on his massive head, whispering encouragement in the way children do when they believe their words have real power. "You're being so brave, Buddy," she murmured. "Braver than the knights in my storybooks. Daddy would be proud of how strong you are." Outside, word had spread through Heartland with the efficiency that only small towns possess. Pickup trucks and cars began arriving at Henderson's general store, their occupants emerging with cash, supplies, and the kind of determined community spirit that had built these farming towns generations ago. Old rivalries and recent grudges seemed forgotten in the face of a shared mission. Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store and hadn't spoken to May Henderson since their property line dispute 2 years ago, arrived with a box of first aid supplies and a $20 bill. "For the dog," he said gruffly, avoiding May's eyes but clearly meaning every word. The Kowalski family, struggling dairy farmers who rarely had money for anything beyond necessities, brought homemade sandwiches for the volunteers and a mason jar filled with carefully counted dollar bills. "It's not much," Mrs. Kowalski apologized, but the children insisted. Even old Frank Murdoch, the town grump who complained about everything from property taxes to the weather, showed up with his veterinary supplies from his own cattle ranch. "Dog deserves a fighting chance," he muttered, as if doing good deeds was somehow embarrassing. But it was the arrival of the Clearwater family that created the most tension. Jim Clearwater owned the largest farm in the county and served on the town council. He'd been vocal about his opposition to wasteful spending on what he called non-essential services, which included everything from the library to animal control. His presence made several people shift uncomfortably. "Heard there was some kind of medical emergency," Clearwater said, his tone carefully neutral as he surveyed the scene. His eyes took in Buddy's condition, the community effort, and Emma's devoted vigil with calculating assessment. "Lot of fuss over a stray dog." Marcus Wheeler, who had been helping organize supplies, straightened defensively. "It's not a stray. It's Jake Thompson's K9 partner, the dog that served with the police department. Jake Thompson's been dead 3 years, Clearwater replied bluntly, ignoring Rosie's sharp intake of breath. "That makes it a stray in my book. And last I checked, we've got real problems in this town. Failing businesses, foreclosures, people leaving every month. Seems like misplaced priorities to spend money on a dog when human beings are struggling." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Several people looked down at their feet, suddenly uncertain. Clearwater had a point, even if he'd made it harshly. Times were hard, money was scarce, and every family represented here had their own financial struggles. Emma looked up from her position beside Buddy, her young face serious as she processed the adult conversation. "Mr. Clearwater," she said with the fearless directness that only children possess, "are you saying we shouldn't help someone who's hurt just because we have problems too?" Clearwater found himself looking down at a 6-year-old girl whose question cut straight to the heart of his argument. "It's more complicated than that, young lady. Resources are limited. My grandma says when you help somebody, it comes back to help you too," Emma continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension her words were creating. "Like when Mr. Wheeler decided to help us even though he was scared, now Tommy isn't scared anymore and they both feel better." Tommy Wheeler, who had been quietly petting Buddy's uninjured leg, looked up at the mention of his name. "She's right, Mr. Clearwater. I was scared of all dogs because one hurt me, but Buddy's teaching me that being scared of everything doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you from having friends." Dr. Miller paused in her work, clearly moved by the boy's words. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured, echoing May Henderson's earlier sentiment. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his voice carrying the gentle authority that came from decades of mediating community disputes. "Jim, I understand your concerns about priorities. But sometimes, taking care of the smallest, most vulnerable members of our community, whether they have 2 legs or 4, is exactly what reminds us why we're fighting to keep this place alive in the first place." "Pretty words, Pastor, but they won't pay anybody's mortgage," Clearwater replied, though his tone had lost some of its edge. "I'm not saying the dog should suffer, but maybe there are more practical solutions. Animal control could—" "Put him down," Marcus finished quietly. "That's what you're suggesting, isn't it?" Clearwater's silence was answer enough. The suggestion created a ripple of discomfort through the gathered crowd. Even those who had questioned the expense of treatment weren't prepared to discuss euthanasia as a cost-saving measure. It was then that an unexpected voice joined the conversation. "That dog saved my life." Everyone turned to see Bill Martinez, a quiet man in his 50s who worked maintenance for the county and rarely spoke at community gatherings. He approached Buddy with obvious recognition, his weathered face showing emotion that surprised those who knew him. "3 years ago, I was working late at the courthouse when two men broke in looking for drug money from evidence lockup," Bill continued, his voice steady but strained. "They had guns, were higher than kites, and would have killed me without thinking twice. This dog," he gestured toward Buddy, "and Officer Jake Thompson showed up just in time. Buddy took down one of the gunmen, saved both our lives." The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Jake's heroics were local legend, but many people hadn't known the details of his various arrests and rescues. Bill knelt beside Buddy, who weakly lifted his head in recognition. "Hey there, partner. Remember me?" To everyone's amazement, Buddy's tail managed a faint wag. "Jim Clearwater. This dog's got more service record than half the town council. If we can't scrape together $300 to save a genuine hero, what does that say about who we are?" The challenge in Bill's words was unmistakable, and Clearwater found himself on the defensive. "I'm not against helping," he said stiffly. "I just think we need to be realistic about what we can afford." "How much did the town spend on that new sign at the city limits last year?" May Henderson asked pointedly. "The one announcing our historic downtown shopping district that consists of 3 working businesses?" "That was different," Clearwater began, but May cut him off. "Different how? Because it was about image instead of substance? Because it helped politicians feel good instead of actually doing good?" Her voice rose with decades of stored frustration. "Jim Clearwater, I've known you since you were in diapers, and I remember when your family needed help. Remember when your father's barn burned down? This whole town came together to rebuild it, didn't ask about his insurance situation or whether it was the most practical use of resources." Clearwater's face reddened, but before he could respond, his own daughter spoke up from the crowd. Jenny Clearwater, home from college for the weekend, had been quietly observing the exchange with growing embarrassment. "Dad, please stop," she said, her voice carrying the particular mortification that only teenagers could manage. "You're literally arguing against saving a police dog in front of the entire town. How do you think that looks?" The combination of public pressure, personal history, and family embarrassment finally broke through Clearwater's resistance. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $50 bill, placing it on the makeshift donation table with obvious reluctance. "Now for the dog," he said tersely, "but I still think we need better long-term planning for situations like this." Emma beamed at him as if he'd just personally solved world hunger. "Thank you, Mr. Clearwater. Buddy's going to remember that you helped him, and maybe someday he can help you too." The innocent optimism in her voice seemed to diffuse the remaining tension. People began talking among themselves again, the crisis of community confidence having passed. Dr. Miller returned to her work with renewed focus, while the donation total continued to climb as more neighbors arrived. By late afternoon, the impossible had happened. The community had not only raised the necessary funds for Buddy's treatment, but had exceeded their goal by nearly $100. More importantly, something intangible but vital had been restored. The sense that Heartland was still a place where people looked out for each other, where helping the vulnerable wasn't seen as weakness but as strength. As the sun began to set, painting the general store in golden light, Buddy's condition had stabilized dramatically. The IV fluids had rehydrated him, antibiotics were fighting the infection, and his vital signs were strong. He was going to survive, and with proper care he would eventually make a full recovery. Emma had never left his side, maintaining her vigil with the dedication of a trained nurse. Now, as Buddy's breathing became easier and his eyes more alert, she leaned down to whisper in his ear. "See, Buddy, I told you everything would be okay. Sometimes grown-ups make things complicated, but love is simple, and there's lots of love here for you. Just as hope was beginning to bloom in the hearts of everyone gathered at Henderson's General Store, the sound of sirens shattered the peaceful evening air. Two vehicles pulled up outside, a county animal control truck and a sheriff's patrol car. The cheerful atmosphere inside the store immediately tensed as Deputy Sheriff Mike Patterson and Animal Control Officer Janet Walsh entered with grim expressions. "Folks, I'm going to need everyone to step back," Deputy Patterson announced, his hand resting on his radio. "We've received reports of a dangerous animal situation and possible violation of county ordinances regarding wild animal possession." Dr. Miller straightened from her position beside Buddy, her face flushing with indignation. "Mike Patterson, you've got to be kidding me. This is a medical emergency, not a dangerous animal situation." Officer Walsh, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and the officious manner of someone who took bureaucracy very seriously, stepped forward with a clipboard and what appeared to be legal documents. "Ma'am, according to County Code 47.3b, any unregistered canine over 50 pounds displaying aggressive behavior must be quarantined pending a rabies evaluation and behavioral assessment." "Aggressive behavior?" Emma's voice was high with disbelief. "Buddy hasn't been aggressive. He's been hurt and scared, but he hasn't tried to bite anybody." The initial report indicated a large German shepherd had attacked and injured a minor, Walsh replied coldly, consulting her paperwork. "Standard protocol requires immediate containment." A horrible silence fell over the room as everyone realized what was happening. Someone had called animal control and reported a false or misleading version of events, turning their rescue mission into a law enforcement matter. Marcus Wheeler's face had gone ashen. "That's not... I never said he attacked anyone. I told dispatch there was an injured dog, nothing about an attack." Deputy Patterson looked uncomfortable but determined to follow procedure. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but the report I received was pretty specific. Large, aggressive dog, child endangered, possible rabies exposure. I have to follow protocol." "This is insane," May Henderson burst out. "Mike, you've known this family your whole life. Does Emma look like she's been attacked by a rabid dog?" But Officer Walsh was already approaching Buddy with a catch-pole, a long metal rod with a noose at the end designed to restrain potentially dangerous animals from a safe distance. The sight of the device made Buddy lift his head with obvious alarm, his ears flattening against his skull. "No!" Emma threw herself protectively across Buddy's body, her small arms spread wide as if she could shield an 85-pound dog through sheer determination. "You can't take him. He's sick and he needs medicine." "Little girl, step away from the animal immediately," Walsh commanded, "for your own safety." "Emma, honey, come here," Rosie said urgently, but her granddaughter shook her head fiercely. "I won't let them hurt him. Buddy trusts me, and I promised I'd keep him safe." Emma's voice cracked with the kind of desperate determination that came from losing too much already in her short life. The standoff created an impossible situation. Walsh couldn't safely approach Buddy with Emma in the way, but attempting to forcibly remove a 6-year-old from a dangerous animal would look terrible and could result in actual injury. Deputy Patterson clearly didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also couldn't ignore county protocols. It was Tommy Wheeler who broke the impasse in the most unexpected way. The 9-year-old boy, who had spent a year afraid of all dogs, suddenly stood up and walked directly to Buddy's head, placing his small hand on the dog's muzzle in a gesture of absolute trust. "If Buddy was dangerous," Tommy said with the clear logic of childhood, "would I be able to do this?" He gently scratched behind Buddy's ears, and the dog's tail moved in a weak but unmistakable wag of contentment. Marcus stared at his son in shock. "Tommy, what are you doing?" "Proving that the grown-ups are wrong," Tommy replied simply. "Again." Officer Walsh's professional composure began to crack as she watched the scene unfold. Here was a child with documented trauma from a dog attack willingly interacting with the supposedly dangerous animal, while another child refused to leave its side despite official warnings about safety. "This doesn't change the regulations," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I still have to follow procedure." "Whose procedure?" Pastor Williams stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Janet, I've known you since you were in Sunday school. Is this really what you think is right?" Dr. Miller seized the moment to present medical evidence. "Officer Walsh, this dog's temperature is normal, he's responding appropriately to human contact, and he's showing no signs of neurological disturbance. Whatever you were told about aggressive behavior is simply not supported by clinical observation." The report specifically mentioned the report was wrong. A new voice interrupted from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Jim Clearwater entering the store, his face grim with what appeared to be guilt and determination. "I'm the one who called it in." The admission sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. Several people stepped back from Clearwater as if his confession made him physically dangerous. "You did what?" May Henderson's voice was deadly quiet. "I called animal control," Clearwater repeated, meeting no one's eyes. "After I left here earlier, I got to thinking about liability issues, about what could happen if that dog really was dangerous and hurt someone. I thought I was being responsible." "You thought you were being responsible by lying to the authorities?" Dr. Miller's professional composure finally cracked. "Jim, that dog was under medical care, surrounded by people who were helping him. What part of that seemed dangerous to you?" "I didn't lie," Clearwater protested weakly. "I said there was a large dog, possibly aggressive, in a situation involving children. Technically, you nearly destroyed everything we've built here today," Marcus Wheeler interrupted, his voice shaking with anger. "My son overcame his deepest fear to help this animal, and you called the authorities to have it destroyed." Emma looked up at Clearwater with the kind of devastating disappointment that only children could manage. "Mr. Clearwater, you said you wanted to help. Why did you try to hurt Buddy after you gave money to save him?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Clearwater found himself faced with the reality that his responsible action had been driven not by genuine concern for safety, but by his own discomfort with the community's emotional investment in what he saw as an impractical cause. "I thought," he began, then stopped. "I thought someone needed to think practically about the consequences." "The consequences of compassion?" Pastor Williams asked gently. "The consequences of a community coming together to help something vulnerable?" Officer Walsh, who had been listening to the exchange with growing discomfort, finally lowered her catchpole. "Deputy Patterson, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Based on my direct observation, this animal poses no immediate threat to public safety. But the regulations," Deputy Patterson began, "allow for discretionary assessment based on circumstances," Walsh finished, "and these circumstances are clearly not what was reported." The relief in the room was palpable, but the damage to community trust had been done. People looked at Clearwater differently now, understanding that his opposition to the rescue effort had gone far beyond philosophical disagreement. Emma, still protective of Buddy but sensing the crisis had passed, looked around at the adults with the kind of weary wisdom that no 6-year-old should possess. "Why do grown-ups always have to make everything so hard?" she asked, the question cutting straight to the heart of the day's conflicts. The tension in Henderson's general store had barely begun to settle when Dr. Miller's expression suddenly changed from relief to alarm. She had been monitoring Buddy's vital signs throughout the confrontation with animal control, and now her stethoscope revealed something that made her heart sink. "His heart rate spiking," she announced urgently, her professional calm cracking. "The stress from all this commotion, his system can't handle it." Buddy's breathing, which had been steadily improving throughout the afternoon, suddenly became labored and irregular. His eyes, which had been alert and responsive, began to glaze over with the unmistakable look of an animal in distress. The IV line that had been delivering life-saving fluids now seemed inadequate against whatever was happening inside his body. Emma, who had maintained her protective vigil beside him, immediately sensed the change. "Buddy? Buddy, what's wrong?" Her small hand pressed against his massive chest, feeling the erratic rhythm of his heartbeat through his fur. Dr. Miller worked quickly, checking pupils, feeling for pulse points, her movements becoming more urgent with each passing second. His blood pressure's crashing. The infection, it's not responding to the antibiotics the way it should. And now, with the stress, she looked up at the gathered crowd, her face grave. "I need to get him to the emergency veterinary hospital in Lincoln. Now." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Lincoln was 2 hours away, and that was assuming traffic and weather cooperated. In Buddy's current condition, 2 hours might as well be forever. "Can't you treat him here?" Rosie asked desperately. "Not with what I have available," Dr. Miller replied, already gathering her equipment. "He needs blood work, x-rays, possibly surgery if there's internal bleeding we haven't detected." "I'm a country vet, not an emergency specialist." Marcus Wheeler stepped forward, keys already in his hand. "I'll drive. My truck's the biggest here, most room for him to lie flat." But as they began preparing for transport, another cruel reality became apparent. Moving Buddy in his current condition could trigger the very crisis they were trying to prevent. Dr. Miller's hands shook as she tried to calculate dosages for medications she didn't have, treatments she couldn't provide. The stress of transport alone could kill him, she admitted quietly to the adults, trying to keep her voice low enough that Emma wouldn't hear. But staying here definitely will. It was then that Tommy Wheeler, the 9-year-old boy who had spent a year afraid of his own shadow, spoke up with startling clarity. "Why don't we call the police helicopter, the one that took Mr. Jenkins to the hospital when he had his heart attack?" The adults exchanged glances. The county did have emergency medical transport, but it was reserved for human emergencies. The idea of using taxpayer-funded emergency services for a dog, no matter how beloved, seemed impossible. "Tommy, that's for people, not animals," his father explained gently. "But Buddy was a police officer too," Tommy insisted with the unshakable logic of childhood. "Officer Martinez said he saved lives. Don't police officers get help when they're hurt?" Deputy Patterson, who had been preparing to leave after the animal control situation was resolved, found himself considering the boy's words. "You know," he said slowly, "there might be something to that. K-9 officers are technically members of the force, and Jake Thompson was killed in the line of duty." The possibility hung in the air like a lifeline. Pastor Williams was already reaching for his phone. "I know the sheriff personally, been knowing him for 30 years. Let me make a call." But even as hope flickered back to life, Buddy's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became more shallow, his responses to Emma's voice less frequent. Dr. Miller increased the fluid drip, administered what pain medication she had available, but she was fighting a losing battle with inadequate tools. Emma, sensing the gravity of the situation in the way that children sometimes do, leaned down close to Buddy's ear. "Don't give up," she whispered fiercely. "Daddy wouldn't give up, and neither can you. We're going to get you help, I promise." It was then that the most unexpected ally emerged from the crowd. Jim Clearwater, who had been standing apart from the group since his confession about calling animal control, suddenly stepped forward with his cell phone in hand. "I may have caused this crisis," he said quietly, "but I'm going to fix it." Without explanation, he dialed a number and walked outside for privacy. Through the store window, they could see him engaged in an intense conversation, his free hand gesturing emphatically. When he returned 5 minutes later, his face showed a mixture of determination and something that might have been redemption. "Medevac helicopter will be here in 20 minutes, he announced to the stunned gathering. "My brother-in-law runs the emergency services department for the region. I told him we had a retired K-9 officer down, medical emergency, and that the dog was technically still on the force due to Jake Thompson's posthumous benefits." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. No one had known that Clearwater had family connections to emergency services, or that he was capable of the kind of creative interpretation of regulations that he'd just demonstrated. "How did you manage that?" Dr. Miller asked, already preparing Buddy for transport. Clearwater's voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "I may have implied that the dog was still actively working in some capacity and that his emergency was related to a current investigation. It's not entirely untrue. He was investigating that trap when he got hurt." The ethical gray area of his statement wasn't lost on anyone, but faced with Buddy's deteriorating condition, no one was inclined to question the moral flexibility that might save his life. Emma looked up at Clearwater with new respect. "You fixed your mistake," she said simply. "That's what good people do." The words seemed to affect Clearwater more than any adult criticism had. He knelt beside Emma, his voice unsteady. "I'm sorry, little one. I was scared of making the wrong choice, so I made the worst choice instead. Sometimes adults are just as scared as kids, but we're not as brave about admitting it." As they waited for the helicopter, the community that had been divided by fear and misunderstanding found itself united again by shared purpose. May Henderson organized supplies for the trip to Lincoln, while Pastor Williams contacted the emergency veterinary hospital to prepare them for Buddy's arrival. Marcus helped Dr. Miller prepare a portable IV setup, while Tommy maintained a gentle hand on Buddy's head, talking to him about all the adventures they would have once he was better. When the helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, its rotors beating against the darkening sky, Emma felt both hope and terror. This was Buddy's chance, but it was also another separation, another moment when someone she cared about would be taken away to a place she couldn't follow. Dr. Miller would accompany Buddy to Lincoln, where specialist veterinarians would take over his care. The rest of them would have to wait, hope, and trust that their makeshift rescue mission would ultimately succeed. As the emergency crew loaded Buddy into the helicopter, Emma pressed something into Dr. Miller's hand, a small, worn photograph of her father in his police uniform standing beside Buddy in happier times. "Show this to the doctors," she said, with 6-year-old solemnity. "So they know Buddy's important. So they know he's got people who love him waiting for him to come home." Dr. Miller tucked the photograph carefully into her medical bag, understanding that she was carrying more than just an image. She was carrying the hopes of an entire community, the healing dreams of a traumatized boy, and the unshakable faith of a little girl who believed that love could conquer any obstacle. As the helicopter lifted off into the Nebraska evening, its lights blinking against the gathering darkness, those left behind stood together in the parking lot of Henderson's General Store. They were no longer the same collection of individuals who had started this day. They had become something more, a community that had rediscovered its capacity for compassion, sacrifice, and the kind of stubborn hope that refuses to accept defeat. Emma slipped her small hand into Rosie's weathered one, her eyes never leaving the helicopter's disappearing lights. "He's going to be okay, Grandma," she said with quiet certainty. "He has to be. Heroes don't die when people still need them." The call came at sunrise, 3 days after the helicopter had disappeared into the Nebraska sky, carrying Buddy and their collective hopes. Rosie answered the phone in her kitchen, Emma perched on a chair beside her, both of them having barely slept since receiving the last update from Dr. Miller. The specialist veterinarians in Lincoln had performed emergency surgery to remove infected tissue and repair internal damage, but Buddy's recovery remained uncertain. "Mrs. Thompson?" Dr. Miller's voice crackled through the phone, exhaustion evident even across the static-filled connection. "I have news." Emma pressed her ear close to the receiver, her small face tense with anticipation. Over the past 3 days, she had maintained an almost supernatural faith in Buddy's recovery. But even her 6-year-old optimism had been tested by the waiting. "He's going to make it," Dr. Miller continued, and Rosie felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "The surgery was successful, the infection's clearing, and this morning he actually stood up and wagged his tail when I walked in. He's asking for breakfast, which is always a good sign." Emma's shriek of joy could probably be heard 3 counties over. She danced around the kitchen, her nightgown flying as she spun with pure happiness. "I knew it! I knew Buddy was too strong to give up." But Dr. Miller's next words sobered the celebration. "There's something else, though, something we discovered during the surgery that changes everything." Rosie's heart clenched. After so much hope, what new crisis could they be facing? "We found fragments of an old bullet in his shoulder," Dr. Miller explained. "Been there for years, probably from when he was shot in the line of duty. But here's the important part. Inside his collar, sewn into the lining, we found something Jake must have put there before his last assignment." The phone went quiet, except for the sound of rustling paper. Then Dr. Miller's voice returned, thick with emotion. "It's a letter, Rosie, addressed to you and Emma. Jake must have known that last case was dangerous. He wanted to make sure Buddy got home to you if something happened to him." Emma stopped dancing, suddenly understanding that something significant was happening. "What does it say, Grandma?" With trembling hands, Rosie took the letter, Doctor. Miller read over the phone, each word a message from beyond the grave. "Mom and Emma, if you're reading this, something happened to me and Buddy found his way to you like I always knew he would. I've been training him for retirement, teaching him to be a family dog instead of a working dog. He knows Emma's scent from the clothes I carry, and he's been waiting to meet his little sister. Buddy's not just my partner, he's my gift to you both. He'll protect Emma with his life, and he'll love you both the way I wish I could still be there to take care of each other. Love, Jake. P.S. Buddy knows where I hid Emma's college fund. Ask him to find the treasure, and he'll show you." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Rosie sank into her chair, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood that Buddy's arrival hadn't been coincidence or accident. It had been Jake's final act of love, a father's way of continuing to care for his family even after death. Emma, with the acceptance that children bring to magic, simply nodded as if she'd known all along. "Daddy sent Buddy to take care of us," she announced matter-of-factly. "That's why I dreamed about them together. Daddy was telling me to get ready." The phone rang again, almost immediately. Word was spreading through Heartland with the same efficiency that had mobilized the community 3 days earlier. May Henderson called to share the news that the morning edition of the Lincoln Journal-Star had picked up Buddy's story. Pastor Williams reported that the regional television station wanted to do a feature on the community rescue effort. Even the governor's office had called, praising the Nebraska spirit that had saved a hero's life. But the most meaningful call came from Marcus Wheeler. "Rosie," his voice was thick with emotion, "Tommy's been asking every hour for updates. When can we visit Buddy? The boy's been a different child since all this happened. Yesterday he asked me if we could get a dog of our own." The transformation in Tommy Wheeler had been remarkable to witness. The fearful, withdrawn boy who had clung to his father's side for a year had emerged from the crisis with new confidence and purpose. He'd been helping other children in town overcome their own fears, sharing his story of how Buddy had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Dr. Miller's voice returned to the phone. "There's one more thing. The specialists here want to keep Buddy for another week of observation, but after that, he'll need a quiet place to complete his recovery. somewhere with people who love him and understand what he's been through. Emma was already jumping up and down. "He's coming home! Buddy's coming home!" But Rosie's practical mind was already calculating challenges. The farm was still facing foreclosure, her heart medication was running low, and caring for a large dog would require resources they didn't have. "Dr. Miller, I appreciate everything you've done, but I'm not sure we can—" "Actually," Dr. Miller interrupted gently, "that's been taken care of. It seems your community has some very determined advocates." Over the next hour, the full scope of what had happened in their absence became clear. The story of Emma and Buddy had touched something deep in the hearts of people far beyond Heartland. Donations had poured in from across Nebraska and beyond, not just for Buddy's medical care, but for the Thompson family's financial struggles that had been mentioned in the news coverage. May Henderson arrived at the farm with a banker's box full of letters and checks. "Honey, you're not going to believe this," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "People from all over the country have been sending money. A retirement home in Florida sent $500, a school in California collected pennies and raised $300. There's even a check from a police department in Texas. Said every K-9 officer deserves to come home." The generosity was overwhelming, but it was the letters that broke Rosie's heart. Children had drawn pictures of Emma and Buddy. Police officers had shared stories of their own K-9 partners. Families who had lost loved ones in the line of duty wrote about the comfort they found in knowing that Jake's final gift had brought healing to a grieving community. One letter from an elderly woman in Iowa particularly moved Rosie. "Dear Emma, I lost my husband in the war 60 years ago. He always said that love never really dies, it just finds new ways to show itself. Your daddy's love is still taking care of you through Buddy. Hold on to that, sweetheart. Love is the strongest thing in the world." Pastor Williams arrived in the afternoon with more unexpected news. "The banks agreed to halt foreclosure proceedings," he announced. "Seems the publicity around the story has embarrassed them into reconsidering their approach to community relations. Plus, with the donations that have come in, you can probably make the back payments and keep the farm." Emma listened to all the adult talk about money and banks with the polite attention of a child who understood that important things were happening but found them less interesting than the real news. "When is Buddy coming home?" she asked repeatedly, until finally Rosie laughed and promised they would drive to Lincoln the moment Dr. Miller gave the all clear. That moment came sooner than expected. The next morning, Dr. Miller called to report that Buddy had not only recovered faster than anticipated, but was actually showing signs of anxiety at being separated from his new family. "He keeps looking toward the door like he's waiting for someone," she explained. "I think he needs to be home as much as you need him there." The drive to Lincoln became a caravan as news of Buddy's homecoming spread. Marcus and Tommy Wheeler insisted on coming along, as did May Henderson, Pastor Williams, and even Jim Clearwater, who had spent the past week trying to make amends for his crisis of faith during the emergency. At the veterinary hospital, the reunion was everything Emma had dreamed it would be. Buddy, though still moving carefully on his healing leg, greeted them with the enthusiasm of a dog who had finally found his purpose. He went directly to Emma, placing his massive head in her small lap as if claiming his rightful place in her life. Tommy Wheeler approached more cautiously, but Buddy seemed to remember their bond from that crucial moment in Henderson's store. The big dog gently nuzzled the boy's hand, sealing a friendship that would help both of them continue healing from their respective traumas. The drive home was filled with chatter about all the things they would do together: walks around the farm, training sessions, lazy afternoons on the porch. Emma regaled Buddy with detailed accounts of everything he had missed during his hospital stay, while Tommy made plans for teaching his new friend all the best hiding spots around Heartland. As they turned into the Thompson farm driveway, Rosie was surprised to see cars lining the road and people gathered on her front porch. The entire community had turned out to welcome Buddy home, bringing casseroles, dog toys, and the kind of genuine warmth that made small towns special. May Henderson had organized a Welcome Home Buddy banner that stretched across the porch, while Pastor Williams led an impromptu blessing for the dog who had brought a divided community back together. Even the local television crew was there, documenting the heartwarming conclusion to a story that had captured hearts across the region. But the most meaningful moment came when Emma led Buddy to the backyard, and remembering Jake's final message, said the magic words, "Buddy, find the treasure." The big dog's ears perked up immediately. He limped purposefully to an old oak tree behind the house and began digging at its base. Within minutes, he had uncovered a waterproof container that held not just money, Jake's carefully saved funds for Emma's education, but also photographs, letters, and a small jewelry box containing his mother's engagement ring. "Daddy really did think of everything," Emma said wonderfully, holding up a photo of Jake and Buddy in their police uniforms. "He made sure we'd have everything we needed to be happy." As the sun set over the Nebraska farmland, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded everyone why their ancestors had chosen to build their lives here, the Thompson family was finally complete. Not in the way any of them had originally planned, but in the way that mattered most, bound together by love, loss, and the unshakable belief that some bonds transcend even death. Buddy settled onto the porch beside Emma's chair, his watchful eyes surveying his new domain with the satisfaction of a dog who had found his purpose. He was no longer a lost police dog wandering through his grief. He was home, where he belonged, protecting the family that Jake had entrusted to his care. And in Heartland, Nebraska, the story would be told for generations about the 6-year-old girl who refused to give up, the community that remembered how to care for each other, and the dog who carried love from one world to the next, proving that the best gifts often come disguised as the greatest challenges. Sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. When 6-year-old Emma May Thompson found that injured German shepherd caught in a trap, she didn't see an impossible burden. She saw someone who needed help, just like her family did after losing her father Jake, a fallen police officer. What followed was a community coming together in ways they'd forgotten were possible. Neighbors setting aside old grudges to save not just a dog, but their own capacity for compassion. This story reminds us that in our golden years, when loss seems to accumulate and the world feels increasingly disconnected, we still possess the power to create miracles through simple acts of kindness. Emma's determination to save Buddy, who turned out to be her father's final gift to his family, shows us that love transcends death, that our legacies live on in the connections we forge and the hope we inspire in others. In a time when many feel forgotten or invisible, Buddy's story proves that every life has value, every act of service matters, and sometimes the family we need most finds us when we least expect it. True happiness isn't about having everything we want. It's about discovering we already have everything we need when we open our hearts to love. Questions for you. What unexpected gifts have found their way into your life during difficult times? How has your community shown up for you when you needed it most?